Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SRNT Europe. It's really fantastic to be here and see you all again in person. We're really, really excited to be hosting this in-person event. And the idea for a debate, I think we really need to thank Dr. Sharon Cox, who's led the scientific committee, for this fantastic, innovative idea. The idea was really to start the conference off by debating some of the key issues in our field, to develop kind of conversations between us, to be thought-provoking, entertaining, above all fun, setting our conference off in a lively and collegiate manner. So we encourage you all to join in with the debate, not during it, please, but afterwards. Continue the debate throughout the conference and share with us some of your opinions and ideas, and of course the very best cutting-edge scientific research to underpin those ideas. So, the way we went about choosing the topic for debate was we put out an open call, thank you to Sharon for doing that, to our colleagues in the field. We had lots of suggestions for debate topics, some very contentious, and we had a careful process of independent review before we arrived at the topic of the debate today. So I don't know if we have a slide for it actually, but the question that we all agreed that we would answer through this debate is nicotine use rational? So before I introduce our panel of distinguished experts, I'll just quickly recap on the rules. We'll be adhering to the Oxford Union style debating etiquette. Oh, that's better. So although we're not going to go through the formal process that you might see at an Oxford Union style debate, we will adhere to the kind of rules around not interrupting each other, keeping strictly to time. I'll be timing our debaters. No interjections from the floor, please, during the speeches. Certainly no heckling. The only reason that a speaker may be interrupted is potentially due to a point of order, which that I as chair will uphold if necessary. I'm sure that won't be necessary. Any points of clarification you may have, please keep to the Q&A session after we've heard from each of our speakers. So each speaker will have precisely 5 minutes, no more, to make their key points for or against the motion. And then hopefully we'll have time for some very brief questions from the audience. I ask you to keep your questions to the end, to keep them very brief, to enable as many people as possible. Then we'll ask our debating teams to give their final statements and rebuttal before we close with an audience vote. So we want to hold a very brief vote to see where we all stand at the start of this debate. I will ask everyone, please, in the room to make sure they vote, yes, no, or abstain. The only exception to this is I know that some speakers for the next parallel session are feeling that they will need to leave a bit early, so if you're going to do that, don't vote, because otherwise our numbers are not going to add up. So first of all, I would like to see a show of hands, please, in favour of the motion that yes, nicotine use is rational. As high as possible to help our lovely volunteers with the counting. Keep your hands raised, please, while we count. Thank you. And now please raise your hands, those in favour of the motion that no, nicotine use is not rational. Keep your hands raised, please. Okay, and finally, those who abstain, please raise your hands. Blimey. Thank you. So now, without further ado, we'll move on. Let me please thank in advance and introduce our debaters. Debating for the motion that yes, nicotine use is rational, we have Professor Lynn Dawkins, Professor of Tobacco Addiction at London South Bank University, and she is joined by Emeritus Professor Wayne Hall of the University of Queensland. And debating against the motion that no, nicotine use is not rational, we welcome Professor Leon Shahab of University College London, together with Dr. Yael Bar-Zeev of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So I'm going to ask each of you to come up, please, to the lectern in turn, and let me please formally welcome our first speaker, Professor Lynn Dawkins.
Thank you very much. Members of the audience, Professor, Madam Chair, and fellow debaters, I stand before you today to argue that nicotine use is indeed rational. Rational decision-making often involves doing something for a reason, weighing the benefits against the costs, even if this isn't done very well, considering individual circumstances and personal autonomy. Nicotine is used by millions of people worldwide. It's hard to believe that each and every one of these people is behaving irrationally. I will now present a number of compelling reasons why nicotine use can be considered rational. Rationality often involves respecting an individual's autonomy and personal choices. Adults should have the freedom to make informed decisions about their own lives, including whether or not to use nicotine products. As long as they are aware of the risks, it can be rational to exercise this autonomy. Nicotine use involves a number of benefits. So firstly, it has been shown to have certain stress-relieving or anxiety-alleviating properties. So using nicotine could be a rational choice to help people manage when they're feeling stressed or anxious, to help them cope, at least in their eyes. And even if people are using nicotine to alleviate cravings, that's still a rational choice, because for them, it will make them feel better. Nicotine can enhance the reward value of other reinforcers. There's very strong evidence for this in rats and increasing evidence in humans. For example, listening to music or watching film clips has been reported as more enjoyable if the person has had nicotine. Thirdly, nicotine can also have cognitive enhancing effects. Studies in smokers and non-smokers, in a review in 2010, from about 41 studies, there was clear evidence that nicotine can improve arousal, attention, increase alertness and vigilance, and have some impacts on improving memory. So when someone needs to concentrate and stay alert, for example, if they're engaging in a demanding academic task or a professional task, then individuals might use nicotine to boost their cognitive performance. And that, I would argue, is rational, especially if that nicotine use doesn't involve smoking. And the fourth beneficial effect is social connection. So smoking, and of course much more recently vaping, can be a social activity for many people. In social settings, using nicotine products can facilitate bonding and connection with others. I've spoken to a lot of young people about their vaping, and they tell me that I might buy a vape on a night out. That helps me fit in with my peer group. It's an excuse to leave the dance floor. It's a conversation starter when I'm at a club. You might think this ill-advised, but it doesn't make it irrational. For some individuals, and certainly for some nicotine products, the social benefits may outweigh any health risks, making it a rational choice from that person's perspective. Now, importantly, even if people think that using nicotine will have one or more of these positive benefits, what we call positive outcome expectancies in psychology, that is enough for it to be a rational behaviour, even if it doesn't have those positive benefits on every single occasion. And sometimes, actually, people use nicotine without thinking at all. They just engage in the behaviour without questioning their actions. That's not irrational. It's not against one's better judgment. It's just that the person hasn't thought about it. Another argument I want to make around rationality is that it involves short-term benefits and long-term consequences. So for some individuals, the immediate gratification provided by nicotine often outweighs the long-term health risks, or indeed the longer-term intentions not to use nicotine. But making the choice to use right now, at least from their perspective, is a rational choice. One could even go further and argue that it's always rational to use in the short term, that just one more argument, because there's usually a reason for using right now, even if longer-term use might not be advisable. A final example is harm reduction. In cases where somebody is already smoking, transitioning to a less harmful nicotine product is a rational choice, as these products are considerably less harmful than smoking, and my colleague will say a little bit more about this. So I think we can all agree that rational behaviour means behaving in ways that maximise your goals, or put another way, doing something for a reason. But immediate behaviour can often conflict with long-term goals because priorities change, situations change, our decision-making is often faulty, we don't always completely weigh up the costs and benefits, and that doesn't mean our decision-making is irrational. It might be faulty, but it's not irrational. So why should nicotine use be any different?
Well, I'm persuaded. Anyhow, so I start from the position that if nicotine use is rational, then one would want to maximize its benefits while minimize its harm. On the harm side of the equation, it therefore makes sense to look at the safest form of nicotine delivery, medicinal nicotine available through nicotine replacement therapy. The reason for that is that as rational beings, the general assumption is that we would not intentionally harm ourselves against our wishes. So any product that carries potential for harm cannot represent a rational first choice for nicotine use, including cigarettes or e-cigarettes. Similarly, if we were to argue that engaging in sport and physical activity is rational, I would expect that people start with floor exercise in the gym, not base jumping. The first question to ask then is whether medicinal nicotine carries any risk, both acutely or in the long term. Nicotine acutely increases heart rate and blood pressure and acts as a vasoconstrictor in coronary and skin blood vessels. This can contribute to impaired wound healing, placental dysfunction during pregnancy, and has been linked to acute events in at-risk populations, for instance, stroke. While evidence for these more severe forms, acute effects, is not strong, there's more persuasive evidence that NRT use is associated with heart palpitations and chest pains. Longer-term use of NRT has been linked to both insulin resistance and cardiovascular abnormalities such as tachycardia and arrhythmia. To summarize then, there's some evidence that even medicinal nicotine use can result in unpleasant side effects acutely and in at-risk populations in more severe outcomes. And long-term use likely carries risks for some health outcomes, notably diabetes. Notwithstanding the above, let's assume that nicotine use carries no risks at all. If nicotine use is rational, then there ought to be some benefit to users of doing so, otherwise why would you spend money on buying nicotine? So nicotine is credited as having health, cognition, and general psychological benefits, so let's look at these in turn. First, when it comes to health, people often claim that nicotine could help treatment of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. However, most of their evidence in this area comes from observational studies of combustible nicotine use, and there's not a single trial in humans that has shown any real benefit of nicotine treatment for either disease. The last one was actually just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing yet another null finding in August. Now, while cigarette smoking is associated with lower weight, which could be considered a benefit, there's much less evidence that this is mediated entirely by nicotine, as shown by weight gain following smoking cessation, even when NRT is used. When it comes to cognition, so the second point, the argument goes that nicotine has positive effects on thinking and performance, as my colleague would let you know. Quite apart from the fact that if this were true, it likely would be a banned substance under doping regulation, there is actually little evidence for this. Most positive effects are observed among nicotine-deprived users, where nicotine use remediates nicotine withdrawal symptoms. In non-smokers, nicotine improves performance only in a limited number of instances, such as finger-tapping rates, and certainly not for more meaningful outcomes such as IQ or educational attainment. Most importantly, people argue they enjoy using nicotine, albeit only more harmful forms of nicotine use, which may be reasonable if even greater benefits can offset the harm. The problem with the reported psychological and hedonic benefits of this nicotine use it relaxes, makes me sociable, improves my mood, etc., is that as over time any initial positive effect is homeostatically balanced by negative effects, withdrawal symptoms, these come to dominate with chronic use and in fact drive dependence. So the feeling of relaxation is really the relief from unpleasant withdrawal symptoms caused by nicotine use in the first instance. The constant back and forth to avoid withdrawal symptoms actually results in overall negative consequences. There's very good evidence that both starting smoking deteriorates and stopping smoking improves psychological well-being. And even after stopping smoking, it's interesting to note that continued non-combustible nicotine use is associated with worse mental health outcomes compared with stopping nicotine use altogether. Now, given that even the safest form of nicotine use has some negative effects on physical and mental well-being, with very little apparent benefits of use, it's perhaps not surprising that only 0.1%, 1 in every 1,000 non-smokers, uses medicinal nicotine. If nicotine use represents a rational choice, it's not one that's very often taken. De novo nicotine use is popular only in forms that are proven to be harmful, as in the form of cigarettes, or that likely carry some residual risks, as in e-cigarettes. As I argued, engaging in potentially harmful behavior is difficult to square with a rational choice unless there's substantial benefit that would offset such potential risks. However, as I've also shown, the reason that people engage in this behavior is not because of actual benefits, but perceived benefits. Perceived rather than actual, because the more popular and harmful delivery methods differ from medicinal nicotine in one crucial aspect. Due to their vaster delivery mechanism, they are more dependence forming. It's a relief from the withdrawal symptoms that drive this dependence, which are construed as positive when in fact they're nothing of the sort. The lack of any real benefit of nicotine use combined with the residual risks present even for the safest form of nicotine use is the reason why hardly anyone uses nicotine if it does not make them dependent. It's just not rational.
Who will give our final talk for the motion that nicotine use is rational.
Thank you. I think we can all agree that some forms of nicotine use are not rational, and cigarette smoking is clearly one of those. It's the most addictive form of nicotine delivery that delivers all sorts of tars and carcinogens. It's initiated typically in adolescence before people are able to make informed choices, and many smokers regret having started. That doesn't mean that there are other ways of obtaining nicotine that can be much more rational, or at least as rational as many other choices that human beings make, about whether to marry, about whether to have children, all of which can involve regret, can be poorly made, and can have long-term consequences that are adverse to our health and well-being. Not to mention, of course, drinking alcohol, coffee, eating chocolate, red meat, and a whole variety of other things that lots of us do and regard ourselves as being rational when doing it. And I think clearly, like Liam has indicated, that there are some forms of nicotine use that obviate or avoid many of the harms familiar to us from cigarette smoking. And as he pointed out, pharmaceutical nicotine would be one of those, and I think nicotine pouches and the low nitrosamine smokeless tobacco products used in Sweden and Scandinavia would be others, and potentially and probably e-cigarettes as well. It's certainly the case that the evidence for the cognitive enhancement and other sociable advantages of cigarette smoking is a bit underwhelming. Most of what we know about are the acute effects of nicotine use. But I think one of the obvious and interesting facts about nicotine is that it's a substance that human beings globally have a strong affinity for. When it was brought back from the Americas by Spanish explorers in the 16th century, it was a substance that was used from the tip of Terra del Fuego all the way up to Alaska, and it was a drug that was cultivated and used by people in all of those cultural settings. Within 100 years of its discovery by Western Europeans, it was a global commodity thanks to colonial capitalism. A behaviour that's so commonly engaged in by human beings must be addressing some sort of human needs, however difficult it may be to detect the benefits of the use of the product. I think the other hidden agenda of a lot of these arguments about the irrationality of nicotine is the assumption that if it's irrational, then we can interfere in people's choices in ways that we wouldn't otherwise tolerate it. Certainly we should be warning and advising people of the risks of nicotine, particularly the risk of dependence. We should be restricting adolescent access and doing what we can to minimise public use. But none of those sorts of measures require that we judge everyone who chooses to use nicotine as an irrational being. And that's the view that I would take, that nicotine use can be a rational activity in the same way in which many other imperfect forms of human rationality exist. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's noted that you kept very well to time there, so thank you very much. And then now I'll hand over to Dr. Yael Bar-Zeev, who will be our final speaker against the motion that nicotine use.
Thank you. So I want to start with the Oxford Dictionary definition of what is rational. Something that is rational is something that is driven by reason and not by emotion. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about me. So when I was 15, I went to a club to party with my friends and drink. Some of my friends smoke, and they offered me a cigarette. They didn't actually offer, they pressured me to take the cigarette. Did I take the cigarette? Yes. Was it a rational choice, driven, thinking the pros and cons of whether it's good or bad to take that cigarette? No. I did it on a spur of a moment because of the emotions that I was feeling when they were pressuring me and calling me a goody two-shoes and telling me that it's, just try it out, it's no big deal. And a lot of us that have worked with people who are smokers, when you ask them why, tell me about your first smoking experience. Why did you take that first cigarette? You don't hear a thought process of a pro and con. What you hear is, I was there, it was there. I was curious, I was bored, it was right in front of me. Everything on YouTube or something made it seem so, intriguing. People around me are using it. It looks like it might be good. The flavors look really good. So you don't really see that rational thought process in that. You see people that are driven by something that is in the moment. And there's actually a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, that together with his colleague, Amos Tversky, his whole research was about that people don't actually, even when they think that their choice is rational, it's not. So I want to read 2 quotes from an interview with him. When it comes to making decisions, humans are predisposed to irrationality. And my favorite, our ability to ignore evidence that is incompatible with our current beliefs is really remarkable. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about, is the addiction part. Before I became an academic, I worked as a public health physician in the Israel Defense Force. And as part of my work, I also did smoking cessation group behavioral therapy. I'm the Israeli chair the chair of the Israel Medical Association for Smoking Cessation. And at the first meeting of our group, the first thing that you do after everybody introduces themselves is ask people, why are you here? Why do you want to quit smoking? And you hear what I'm sure you'll know is, it's harmful, we don't want to get cancer or heart attacks, it costs too much because the taxes are increasing. Some talk about it being socially unacceptable, stigmatized, family pressuring them. But you also hear people talking about the fact that they don't want to be addicted anymore. I don't want something controlling me. My mother, who in a month from now is going to be 80 years old, was a heavy smoker before. She quit about 20 years ago. Unfortunately, she has severe COPD and she's now on permanent oxygen treatment. But she told me that when she was a heavy smoker and they forbade smoking on planes, she couldn't get on a plane to fly to the US because it was too difficult. She had to break the flight to get to the US. I had a patient telling me that he wasn't willing to buy any shirt. He would never buy a shirt that doesn't have a pocket, so that he could always have someplace to carry his cigarettes. I'm sure you've all heard of stories of people getting up in the rain, in the cold, at 3 a.m. in the morning to find a kiosk open to buy a pack of cigarettes. I had patients admitting to me, shamefully, being ashamed, that they actually picked up cigarette butts from the street when they were in despair. That is not a rational decision-making moment. They are driven by the fact that they're addicted. Now, addicted in plain language means that you are using a substance more than you meant to, longer than you intended to. That is not rational. Okay, that is the exact opposite of a rational choice. So no, nicotine use is not rational. Thank you.
thank you very much to our speakers. So I'm sure what you've heard has raised many questions, comments, and possibly some concerns. I'd really like to invite you all as an audience now to join in this debate. Please raise your hand with any question, and can I ask you to introduce yourself, say your question, and then ask it of a particular person on the panel, please. We're going to come to you with microphones because this is being recorded, so if you can wait for the microphone, that would be great. We'll start here with Robert. We want to check them on, Robert. Just... We have just 10 minutes, by the way, so quick fire questions, please.
So, thank you very much. I mean, very, very persuasive arguments on all sides. So, my contribution from the floor, Robert West, is this. We are, and one of the great things about a debate like this, scientific debate, is that you can come to it from any possible angle, and it provides an opportunity to explore those angles. So this is my angle on this, and I don't think it is rational, and the reason is that right from the time in which Martin and I and others were working with Mike Russell, we believed, and we still believe, that nicotine acts on the mesolimbic dopamine pathway by binding to receptors in the ventral tegmental area, which causes release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, which then trains the brain to use nicotine. And that's why people do it. And all the rest of this stuff that we hear about, all the beliefs and the arguments and so on, is fundamentally window dressing, that ultimately it's acting on the midbrain, the same midbrain that rats have and other non-human species. So, in my contention, in the definition of rationality, which would be that the decision to make is caused by rational processes, it seems to me that everything we're taught suggests that that's not the case, that these are things that follow from what is essentially a midbrain process. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. No question there? No. Right, any questions? In the middle line, the chap in the black.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Flo Foxon. I'm a data analyst at Pinney Associates, and through Pinney Associates, I consult for Juul. I understand this debate is set up as, for or against the motion, but do you not think it could be a little bit more nuanced than that? Maybe for some people it is rational, for others it's irrational. I think Wayne mentioned that for some products it might be rational, and other products it might be irrational. I'd like to hear just any of you talk about maybe a more nuanced position. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to give your side a plus, which is I can see one rational use of nicotine, replacement therapy, the safest form, which is to treat a form of irritable bowel syndrome. So there's very good evidence that ulcerative colitis benefits from treatment alongside nicotine replacement therapy. It's the only thing I can see. Unfortunately, of course, you have to then take into account as well that another form of irritable bowel disease, Crohn's disease, is negatively impacted by nicotine use. So if you have one form, I could see there's a rational case to be made for nicotine use as a therapeutic.
Thank you. Shall we give the other team a chance to quickly respond to that point?
Yeah, I would agree. There are certainly some nicotine products that the use of would be as rational as anything human beings do. Robert's point's a fair one, but let's sort of rule out sex as well. That stimulates the mesolimbic dopamine system. Most of the things we do that we enjoy do that. So it hardly makes it irrational to do things that tweak our mesolimbic reward system.
And can I add to that? Obviously, I don't know if that's working. Yeah. And the clear example of rational behaviour of a nicotine product is to use as a replacement for smoking. When you're trying to quit smoking, to switch to a less harmful product, of course, is got to be the most rational use of nicotine.
We'll move on to the next question, please.
Thank you.
Please raise your hands. We have the lady at the front here in the dark red, Catherine. It's not on. You may have to shout, Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine Kimber from Northern South Bank University. So just trying to tap into the question from the last gentleman from the Associates about what do you make of social smokers, or not social smokers, so I take that back, social e-cigarette users, so people who are not necessarily addicted to nicotine, but who might occasionally think that in these social settings, it suits me to actually just have a vape and use nicotine there and then.
So can I get to that? I think they are precisely addicted to nicotine. You can use, there's nicotine inhalers. I don't see many people hanging around corners using the nicotine inhaler and calling it social. It does the same thing. It's a behavioral action. It delivers nicotine, just much more slowly than e-cigarettes. But it's not, as we can see, a social phenomenon. And the reason why that is, it's not dependence forming.
A comment from the other side?
Yeah, I'll have a comment on that. So, as I said, I've spoken to lots and lots of young people. Yeah, they don't use nicotine inhalers because they're just not as accessible. But vaping products, you know, the Lost Marys and so on, anything they can easily get in the shop, which has nicotine in. Maybe if inhalers were in the shop and everyone was using them, they might use those too, because they use them for a reason, to go out, to socialise, to compare their flavours with other people. I said before, it's not advisable to do that, but for them, it's a rational decision to do that.
So just two more questions, I'm afraid. The chap here who has the microphone, thank you.
So it's, hello, Reto Auer, University of Bern, Switzerland. Could you do the effort, because nicotine is a weak stimulant, and could you take position with regard to coffee and then cocaine? What would your answer be on that? If it's rational or not for these two substances?
I didn't quite get the question.
Well, I mean, I had actually a point to make, which is nicotine, of course, is often... I'm going to cite cocaine on the side. I mean, you know, we can talk about it later if you want to, but not in that context, no. So nicotine is often likened to caffeine in terms of its harms and as well as very few harms and its benefits. And it's obviously interesting to note that medicinal nicotine use is very unpopular, whereas coffee use is very popular. Suggesting maybe there's more of an argument made for it to be a rational choice because the benefits outweigh the harms. So 97% of the UK population uses caffeinated drinks on a daily basis. That's 97 out of 100, whereas only 1 out of 1,000 use medicinal nicotine. So I guess there's more of an argument made for it to be a rational choice because the benefits are outweighing any kind of potential harms it may have.
Yeah, I mean, in response to that, I think there's a very similar debate about whether coffee or caffeine is cognitively enhancing. The same sorts of points you made about nicotine can be made about caffeine. But I think the fact that lots of people use it is an interesting phenomenon. The reason why lots of people don't use pharmaceutical nicotine is it's not a very good product for delivering nicotine. And I think there'd be much better ways of delivering nicotine to individuals that might well produce a prevalence of use, if not like that of coffee, but a great deal more than pharmaceutical nicotine.
Thank you. Next question, Clive. Keep it brief, please.
It's a similar theme. I mean, does the panel think that people who were guzzling coffee this morning at the break and drinking wine at the reception this evening, are they acting rationally? Yes or no?
I would argue that yes, they are acting rationally, because I could go further and say that any behaviour in the short term could be rational because it fulfills an immediate need or a goal, whether that is to fit in over a glass of wine or because you just like the taste of it or to boost your performance to stay awake through this debate. There is always a reason for using in the short term.
And would we like a final comment, Yael?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that's part of the nuance that is when somebody, like if I'm doing something, if I'm drinking alcohol, it's a lot of that is driven by my emotions at that moment. So you can call that rational or not rational if there's a reason. Like for you, if there's a reason, then it's rational. But a lot of the reasons that we do something are actually because of what we feel and think about it. So it's a lot very primitive. Like we're not actually doing that thought process of a pro and con, because when you actually do that pro and con, you might not drink that alcohol. There is just something published a few days ago that's saying that, alcohol has been a proven carcinogenic since 1988. When you ask people, nobody knows about it. Like, I did a quick poll and everybody just ignoring that. But they're choosing to ignore that. Is that rational? Is that not rational? They're doing that for a reason, but it's driven by a lot of their emotions. So I would say it's not rational.
Thank you. Well, I'm really, really sorry to have to kind of stemmy this question and answer session. I'm sure we could keep going on this for hours, and we probably will over some other use of substances later, wine. We're going to have a brief rebuttal speech now from each of the sides. So each of the sides are going to have 2 minutes, and you can use that time as you wish, and then we will conclude with a final audience vote. So, Lynn and Wayne, can I ask you to please make your concluding remarks?
Yeah, okay. So nicotine use is clearly a rational behaviour. For smokers, non-combustible products offer a viable smoking cessation and harm reduction tool. There's no denying that is rational. Nicotine also offers a number of benefits, including stress management, enhancing rewards for other activities, cognitive enhancement, and social connectivity. And importantly, even if individuals expect these positive outcomes at the time of using, that's enough for the behaviour to be considered rational. Short-term use, so the choice to use right now, can always be considered rational as there is immediate gratification of some kind. And that could actually involve some weighing up. It's not always driven by emotion. So short-term use might conflict with long-term goals. Your long-term goal might be to eventually stop using nicotine, which on the face of it may seem irrational, but just like in other areas of life, our decision-making is not perfect. We're cognitive misers. We can't always weigh up all the pros and cons. It's faulty. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that choice is irrational.
Sorry, Liam, we're going to have our 2 minutes, and then
we're going to. I wasn't clear on
I did a
that.
hand gesture, but I didn't.
Oh,
sorry.
That's okay. I'll be very briefly on. I think we're all agreed that some forms of nicotine delivery, particularly cigarette smoking, are probably not rational for most people. But that doesn't exclude the fact or the possibility that other forms of nicotine delivery, most clearly oral forms of nicotine delivery, can be as rational as many other things that we do, including drinking coffee and alcohol and eating red meat. Our policies should attempt to facilitate people making rational choices about the selection of nicotine products to use, and that would require, I think, moves towards encouraging non-combustible routes of administration of nicotine.
thank you very much. Bang on time. I'll hand over to our team now arguing against nicotine use being rational again. And Leon, please use your 2 minutes as you wish.
Okay, so one of the arguments that our colleagues made was that millions of people use nicotine, therefore it is rational. Well, millions of people, well, I don't know if millions, but a lot of people are subject to prostitution, binge drinking, driving too fast. Suicide in Japan is done by thousands of people. Does that make it a rational choice? The fact that millions of people makes this choice does not make it a rational choice. The other thing that they were talking about is that it boosts concentration. It facilitates social acceptance. Well, even in countries that have a very high level of nicotine use, in Israel now it's around 20%, in the past it was 45%, it's still not over 50%. So those other 50%, what are they using to increase their concentration, to boost their social acceptability and stuff like that? If that was really what you needed to use for those, then why isn't everybody else doing that?
Okay, so what I hear is that all arguments in favor of nicotine use is rational require redefinition of what is rational. Doing something for a reason. By that logic, I would argue that a gambling addict is rational to take the last bit of money out of their bank account, walk into a casino and spend the money on a roulette because they have a clear disordered outcome expectation of winning. So they have a reason to doing it and fulfilling this need. The idea that rationality is entirely subjective is problematic. It's a carte blanche and basically completely gets rid of the idea of rational decision making. In fact, you can argue then that something that is rational for one person is irrational. And I think we should look for an objective truth there. And the other point that is being made is, on the whole, that harm reduction is a rational choice is true, but it's predicated on a rational use of nicotine first. So you start using nicotine irrationally, and then you rationally choose a safer form of nicotine. So it goes back to a rational choice, really. That's all.
Right, thank you very much. So the time has come for our concluding vote. So as this is a formal debate, as the audience, what I ask you to do now is to put aside your own personal position. I'd like you to think about the arguments that you've heard for and against the motion that nicotine use is rational. Cast your votes on the basis of the arguments that you've heard today here, please. So first of all, I'd ask you all to raise your hands, those in support of the motion that nicotine use is rational. Please raise your hands as high as you can to help with the vote. Count.
Robert's changing his mind.
See, was more people who thought it was. Robert has dissuaded himself.
Thank you. No personal attacks. Not yet. Okay, and those voting against the motion that no nicotine use is not rational, so those in favour of the motion that nicotine use is not rational, please raise your hands now.
Yours. Which is fine, isn't it? I mean, could have argued either way.
Okay. Thank you. And then finally, any abstainers? Raise your hands right up so we can count, please. Okay, we're just doing the final count, I believe. Drum roll.
Just got to work out the difference. I don't know, like with your phone, the way that you vote. Yeah.
So I think the votes are in, although there seems to be a little bit of uncertainty, people leaving the room. Have we got the final votes, Demetra?
Might have to reveal it later.
No, we're going to reveal it now. Before we reveal the final vote, firstly, let me thank again our distinguished speakers who've done such an amazing job outlining the arguments for and against the motion today.
Can we just add that we were allocated a side?
And also,
And conflicts of interest, I'm a vapor, but you know.
I should have said, our poor speakers, these are not necessarily personal positions. They've done very well in putting the arguments for and against, and they don't necessarily represent their own personal views. So, the final vote. It's really close, really close. So the numbers voting in favour of the motion that yes, nicotine use is rational. Pre the vote, we had 42 in favour, and following the vote, we had 43.
It's Robert West.
For the numbers voting against the motion that no, nicotine use is not rational, before the arguments they've heard, we had 72. And afterwards we had 89. Oh. And abstainers reduced slightly, so we went from 25 to 19. So thank you very much. very short time now to move to the parallel sessions. Thank you everyone for joining us in this fun session. Well done.